Hi there, this is Izzy. This week I wanted to have a quick chat with you about sphagnum moss. So sphagnum moss is a really popular growing medium for orchids, but it's one that I've only got into recently. And it's after years and years of growing orchids in bark, mainly because I was struggling to dry out the orchids when they were in the bark. So I thought, no, sphagnum moss can't be for me, because lots of people say sphagnum moss isn't good for home growers, that it's hard to dry out, that it can be quite tricky to use. But I have switched recently, and I just wanted to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages, because it actually has been a really great growing medium for my home. So some of the advantages I've found are how water retentive it actually is for some of my orchids. So here we've got what's quite likely to be a Nelly Isla or similar cross. So this is an orchid that likes a heck of a lot of water. You can see some of the earlier bulbs are showing some evidence of accordion leaves. It happens when these orchids don't get enough water. So in sphagnum moss, this orchid's been really happy in my home. You can see most of this recent growth since it's been in the shop is doing really well. Very, very little evidence that it's lacking in water. So some orchids, like the Nelly Isla, really like having the extra water that the sphagnum moss provides. Other orchids that love that, the Maxillaria tenuifolia back here, here's some cuttings I made of the bigger plant, really loves that extra water. Maxillaria rufescens, here you can also see this is a mixture of sphagnum moss and bark, which is a little bit safer when it comes to drying out, but also still gives you that water retentiveness. And Maxillaria kortski, which has really thrived in moss when it wasn't thriving in bark. So some of these orchids are doing really, really well in moss where they wouldn't have been doing so well in my collection in bark. And that's because they are water lovers. I mean, that's why we've got lots of Maxillarias here, right? But the other thing that I've found with sphagnum moss is that it also makes my life easier. So sphagnum moss is really easy for watering your orchids. You just have to dip the bottom of the pot into some water, like with this. I'd maybe dip it in up to some water down to about here, and then the water will wick up through the rest of the moss and nourish that plant. So it's a very, very easy medium actually for water loving orchids, but it does come with some disadvantages. I must admit it has been hard in the winter to keep these plants dry enough, so I have certainly had to have some repots of my Neofinitias. So here's one hiding here. This one's doing really well. This is the Neofinetia falcata konshima, a striped variegated, a Marmy Island form. And with the Neofinitias, I found that some of my smaller ones are susceptible to crown rot and issues of having too much water around the growing parts of the orchids. So one thing that I found with these and with some of the others is I need to elevate the orchids, the growing part, the rhizome, out of the sphagnum moss, because it holds too much water around the base of the plant. So these I've certainly elevated out of the sphagnum moss. And the other thing you'll notice with the Neofinetia falcata is that it's in a really different pot to a lot of orchids. It's in a very gappy pot, and aeration is a big thing to help the sphagnum moss dry out and help keep the orchids healthy. And so some of that might be done through specialist pots, like with the Neofinitia here. But you could do this with your own at home by just cutting some slits in the pot. So this is what I've done with the Maxillaria kortski. You can see the slits in the side of the pot there. They really help the sphagnum moss to dry out that little bit faster. So it's important to make sure that the moss doesn't get too damp, but also to give the moss plenty of aeration and to keep the growing rhizome out of the moss a little bit where you can. Certainly helps the orchids to thrive. The other thing I found is that I have to pay a little bit more attention to when I water plants that are in sphagnum moss. Because they're susceptible to getting a bit too wet, you want to wait quite a while. So you might be able to hear with this Maxillaria tenuifolia, it's crispy dry. So it is winter, so I'm waiting a little bit longer with the Neofinitia's falcata. So I'm waiting a little longer for that to dry out before I water it. But many of the others as well, I will wait until they are relatively dry. So if we have a look at the possible Nellie Isla here, this isn't bone dry, but it is quite dry in there. I will water this today or tomorrow. So you do end up paying a little bit more attention to when you need to water the orchids, but it is that much faster to water them. So it's incredibly easy media to actually water the orchids with. The other thing that I haven't had issues with, but other people do, is root burn. So one thing about the sphagnum moss is that because it can wick up and hold so much water around the roots, and then that water rapidly evaporates, is it can leave a lot of salts and nutrients behind, and you can end up with root burn. Now, I haven't had that issue here because I have been flushing these with rainwater relatively regularly. But you definitely have to remember to flush when you have sphagnum moss. So overall, I think the sphagnum moss has been really useful for me, and it's certainly helped some of my orchids to really thrive. I really found that with the diversification, of my orchids, that I needed sphagnum moss for some of them to thrive. So if we see the Oncidium Twinkle here was really struggling when I got it. Some of this damage is from the shop and from the grower even. So we've got accordion leaves here, loads of places. And it was very thin, the pseudobulbs were very shriveled. But now it's been in the sphagnum moss, it's really plumped up, it's really thriving. So some orchids really need that. The Oncidium Twinkles benefited, the Maxillarias have done really well. And you can also see some other effects of having enough water. So if we look at the Maxillaria rufescens here, you can see these are the oldest bulbs from when it was potted in bark. They're maybe 1.5 to 2 inches long, 3-4 centimetres, and this is the kind of bulb it's producing now when it's in the mixture of bark and moss. This is a good 2 inches, 7 to 8 centimetres perhaps long. So this plant has really upped its growth size thanks to all the extra water that it's getting. So if you wanted to try sphagnum moss at home, I'd say, give it a go. It's pretty cheap stuff. You can order it in very small amounts, 100 grams at a time. And it's really beneficial for some kinds of orchids. Even some orchids that like to dry out, like the Maxillarias in winter. It certainly gives you a really easy medium for wicking up and watering those plants. And if you're a bit nervous, you can also do the bark and sphagnum mixtures. I guess another disadvantage is you will have to repot these plants a bit more often than you would with bark. So it wouldn't be good for something like an angraecum, which really wants root stability and doesn't like shifting between media. But overall, yeah, I totally suggest you go for it and see if it works for your orchids. That's it for now. I hope that you got something useful out of this video. If you like this video, give it a like, thumbs up. If you want to hear more, just subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.